Hi everyone, my name is Anessa and I am an indie author and I publish under the pen name A.N. Sage. I live in Toronto, Canada, and I write in fantasy, sci-fi, and pretty much anything paranormal. And today we are back with another video and this little mini series, I guess you could call it that, on some tips on plotting your novel. So anything from world building, characters, magic system, politics, and all the rest. We are taking it 1 week at a time, and every week we are tackling a different part of the plotting that happens before you actually start writing your novel. And in this week's video, we are actually going to be talking about character development and how to create characters that are not flat and are dynamic and interesting to get to know and that readers are going to love. So if you're into this, stick around and we'll be back in just a few seconds. Hello, and welcome back to the channel. I am so excited to continue to talk about the things that happen behind the scenes when it comes to plotting your novel. This is my favorite part of writing any book, is getting to know your world, your characters, everything that happens in it, and just plotting it out like you're working on a chessboard. I love this part of writing. It really is one of the most creative outlets for me when it comes to writing a book. And so I think it's important that there are certain things that you can do to kind of help you get through this plotting fiasco, because it can be quite a bit to handle. And there's no right or wrong way really to plot. It's whatever works for you. But I find that there are certain things that you really should be paying more attention to when you're plotting, because not only will it make it easier for you when it starts, like when you start drafting that first draft and when it comes time to actually writing, but there's certain things that readers expect. And I mean, me as a reader, not just a writer, I also expect when I'm reading. And so it's important to kind of nail these things ahead of time so that when you're writing, they're already in place and your mindset is already where it should be to create the best possible book that you can. And so last week we talked a bit about world building, and it was just like kind of like a basic tips on some of the top things that you should do, like top level basically. And we're going to do the same thing with characters. I'll probably at some point do a more in-depth kind of discussion on each of these things and maybe break them up a bit more. But characters, obviously, much like the world and that you're setting your plot and your story in, your characters are the most important part. They are who your readers are either really rooting for or that they despise. And so it's important to develop characters that evoke some kind of emotion, whether positive or negative, characters that don't just flatline throughout your entire story. And it's important also to have characters that feel like real people. That you could possibly pass them on the street or talk to them. It could be somebody you're friends with, somebody that you remember from school. They should really feel very three-dimensional, even if they are just secondary characters or characters in the background. And we're not talking about like some random guy your main character might have passed on the street, but anybody that has dialogue and a point in your story should be really fully developed. And so that's what we're going to talk about today, is how to develop these characters and what are some of the best practices that you can use in creating characters like this. So when you're thinking about your characters in your story, you need to really think about the fact that your character's goals set the stakes for your entire story. So whatever it is that they're trying to accomplish, that defines the way that your story is going to move forward and how other characters are going to interact with this main character. And we are going to be talking mostly about the main character in this video. So if they are like people, if you think of characters as just regular people that you might know, they must have hobbies, pets, friends, histories of their own, opinions, different little obsessions or tics, just like every other regular person would have, whether they're magical people or not. And all of these things inform how your character is going to react to certain plot points. So if something happens in the plot or something happens directly or indirectly to them, this background of who they are, this character development that they have, this personality, defines how they're going to react to that thing. And so you really need to know what that background and that personality trait of theirs is when you're thinking about them, when you're writing them, when you're writing how they react to certain things. And there's different ways to kind of go about doing it. The first and really one of the main important ways is to define whether your character is going to be static or dynamic. Static characters are like the James Bonds of the world, right? They pretty much stay the same throughout the whole thing, and it's everybody around them that kind of changes and has an arc in a way, but their arc is really flat. And that is the point of that character. They're a static character. They are who they're going to be, and nothing is going to change them. They have very set morals, opinions, and ways of behavior. And knowing that ahead of time will define how that character will always react in certain situations. We know that Bond will always save the day. He will always know kind of right from wrong with a bit of that gray area there. He is going to fall in love fast, but not forever. Like, these are just very defined things about this particular character. Now, a dynamic character is somebody who changes as they are hit with these different parts of your story. So as different things happen in your book, your character is going to begin to grow and learn from them and become a different person. And their arc is going to start at one point, go somewhere else, and end somewhere completely different. That opposition is what creates a very dynamic character. And so you need to decide first and foremost what kind of character your main character is going to be. Are they static or are they dynamic? And once you know that, it's easier to get going with the further development of these characters. And once you know what kind of character you are going to be writing, what you want to do is, before you get into anything else, is figure out their backstory. Think about what their history is, what happened to them in the past that made them the way they are now. Everybody has some kind of history. We're not fruit flies, right? We don't just like appear out of thin air, at least at my house, that's what they do. But this is not how people are. We have things that happen to us that create the person that we are today, that really define the kind of characteristic that we have as people today. And so you really want to dig deep into this backstory. Now, this backstory might never see the light of day in your novel, right? Like, you're not going to just spew and dump information about who this person is, or it might come out little by little. You might get to know them, the different things that happen to them, why they are the way they are throughout the entire story. But as a writer, you should really know what that backstory is, because it helps you really get to know your character on a deeper level. I have about like a 15 or so sheet questionnaire that I fill out for each of my main characters, the big important ones when I have big POVs. And it's things from like, what kind of music would they listen to in the car if they were alone? What might have happened with their family before? Like, how do they react to holidays? How do they interact with their siblings? Do they have siblings? Different things like this, just like as I would if I was just interviewing somebody for like a piece, for an interview piece for a blog or something, or a TV show. I have these questions for them as almost as a journalist would, and I answer them on behalf of the characters. And I find after doing that, it's a lot of work, but after doing that, I know my characters so well, because I know exactly what might have happened to them to lead them to the person that I am now working on. And it helps immensely in creating these 3D characters, because whether or not any of that backstory ever comes to the page, it's there in the way that I write them, in the way that they speak, in the way that their emotions work within the different plot points. And so it's important to have that backstory in place. The next thing that you want to think about is, and this is very harder to do in fantasy and those big epic stories, is to give your characters flaws. It could be very easy to say, okay, I have this like character, and like, let's say it's a woman, she's a chosen one, this typical YA trope, and so she has all these powers and she can do this, that, and the other. Well, that's great. She might be able to do them. She probably should be able to do them, because it's probably on her shoulders to save the world or save a person or save whomever, herself. But she must have flaws. She can't be perfect. Nobody's perfect. And people don't relate to perfect things, right? Like, we laugh at videos of people falling down on icy stairs. this is the kind of society that we live in and the kind of humanity that we feel most comfortable with. And so for your character to be relatable to your reader, they must see a little bit of themselves in there. Even if your character sprouts wings and flies away, they must see some kind of relatable human characteristic in them, whether it's that they are not good in social situations, or they have a broken family and now they don't know how to react to other people who have happy families. Maybe they trip a lot, which I know is also a classic trope, but that could be it, right? They could have a few tics that they do. They could be like eating their hair when they're nervous or biting their nails, like just little things that make them more human. It's really important to have those as part of your character's personality as well. And these are also good to put into that backstory if you have like a questionnaire like I talked about, or if you just have notes you're taking on them. Just make sure that you have those flaws in there, because certain things will happen throughout your novel and throughout your plot that might aggravate some of these flaws. That might make them come to the surface more, right? They might retract into themselves a lot when something really big happens where the attention is all on them, because maybe they're not comfortable in that situation because of A, B, and C, right? And so these little flaws will play an important part in your character being well-rounded and somebody that your readers want to root for and want to read more about. And then kind of when you have those flaws in place, it's hard not to think about physical characteristics and different mannerisms, right? Where the flaws kind of play into this as well. We always picture the character a certain way in our minds, and that's important to have. You should know what your character looks like, right? Like their hair color, their eye color, their skin color, the way that they paint their nails, if they paint their nails, how they dress, how they walk. These are all important things for you to have in your head. You don't have to necessarily write them all out. Like you don't need to say your character is staring at a mirror and just describe how they look. But the way that other people interact with them, it does depend on what they physically look like and what their mannerisms are, right? Like it evokes a different kind of interaction from different side characters in your novel, or maybe the antagonist as well, right? And so you should know what your character looks like. It helps to do like a casting, so to find pictures of other people out there, like either celebrities or just people on the internet that you have pictures of, because it helps to kind of figure out when you're writing. It's easier to imagine it in your head, right? Especially like I find if I'm writing a lot of fighting scenes and I know that, say, my main character is very short, as I start to write them, there's certain things she won't be able to do because she'll have tiny little legs like me. And so I need to keep that in mind, and having that vivid picture in my mind of how she moves or he moves, or what they look like, it really helps. Like if my main character has a lot of like really long hair that gets in the way when she's fighting, nothing's gonna be everywhere, right? Like, so I need to add something. Maybe she ties it up, or maybe it's always getting in her eyes and it kind of like gets in the way of fighting, and at the end she somehow figures that out. That's a very foolish, basic, small thing, but tiny little details like this, mentioning them throughout your book, helps the reader visualize your character more without you actually describing them. So it's important to develop these physical characteristics and mannerisms and these physicalities of what they look like ahead of time, so that when you're writing, you can hint at them throughout and offer even more dimension to your main characters. And then the final and the biggest hurdle to take on when you're thinking of your main characters is you need to really give them an arc. This is for dynamic characters. You could have like a mini arc for static characters, of course, or a more, maybe not so much an emotional arc, but like a more of a story, physical arc for static characters. But for dynamic characters, and we'll talk about those because they're just like a bigger beast to tackle, is their arc really needs to work against the plot lines, right? And so they need to start at point A and end up at point B with a bunch of different points in between. And usually the way your arc will work is it'll be literally, there's a name for it for a reason, it's an arc, right? And so they start somewhere low, they move up, and they end up somewhere different. A triangle is a really good way to think of it as well, where one point is the beginning of the story and where your character is as a personality, and then there's the midpoint, and then you have the end point where they're kind of mirroring each other, and they're the opposite of where they originally started. And then when you're thinking about your arc, you want to really establish your character's goals and motivations throughout the story. What do they want to achieve, and what is motivating them to achieve? And like I always, when I started, it was hard for me to understand like the difference almost between goals and motivations. And so just as a quick, very rough explanation, a goal is what they want to do and what they want to achieve and where they want to end up. And the motivation is why they want to do it. And so if your character's goals is to, I don't know, like save their friends from this big bad monster, their motivation could be that the big bad monster might have hurt one of their friends, kidnapped one of their friends, their family, etc., right? And so that's the motivation that kickstarts this goal, right? That makes the goal develop. And so let's pretend you have a character, they're going to school, a evil witch comes in and curses this boy that she's in love with, and so that's her motivation, right? And her goal now is to defeat the witch and save the boy. So that's a good way of kind of thinking about goals and motivations and what they are. At least it's helped me kind of wrap my head around it when I was starting out. And you also want to make sure that there's enough conflict in your character. And so that means both external and internal conflict. And a good way to break it apart is you want to think about, almost have like a table where you have your goals on one section, your motivations are another, and then you would have your beginning, middle, and end, and you would break those down further into external and internal, right? So you're going to think about what your character's goals are internally at the beginning and externally at the beginning, and what they are in the middle point, externally and internally, and what those goals are at the end, externally and internally, and do the same thing for motivations. And you want to make sure that that conflict that's in there, those things that are getting in their way, that they're not only believable, they don't even have to be huge, right? Like their conflict could just be self-doubt throughout the whole thing, or thinking they don't belong anywhere. That's a big one, especially in fantasy and YA fantasy particularly, or not having anybody they can trust, refusing to fall in love, not thinking that they're strong enough. These are all conflicts, right? And those conflicts, let's take not belonging as an example for a conflict. So internally, they could be pushing themselves to want to fit in. They could be always feeling like they're like the outcast, like they're not good enough. And then externally, they could be pushing people away because of it, right? So they could have attitude, they could be snappy, they could use humor to deflect, right? These are all things that are very human things to do when you have conflicts, both internally and externally. And another part of the external conflict is, of course, the plot. How does the plot make your character change in this arc of theirs? What happens to them? So let's say that there's a doorway of no return, that the guy that she likes or loves, whatever, gets cursed. That's her first doorway, no return. So her arc now has to change. She was la-di-da, going along, having this crush on this boy and whatever, and feeling like she's not good enough for him. And now he's cursed, and she wants to help him, and something else happens that makes her the only person who can now help him, right? So that arc propels right away. It goes somewhere completely different. And you want to think of these external conflicts that open up the world for your character so much more, because when that world opens up, that gives them a window to change. And you want as many of these windows as possible, so it's a natural arc, so that your character doesn't start as this like meh, withering willow, right? I'm so afraid and I can't do anything. And then all of a sudden, like 200 pages in, she's like this badass who's like fighting demons and monsters. It just doesn't feel realistic. Things need to happen along the way that make her change. Think of your life, right? If I think of my life, who I was, like say in high school, is laughable. Like it's compared to who I currently am. but I didn't become this way. So many things happened along the way. I have different jobs. I met different people. I had my heart broken. I tried different things and failed. Like, these are all things that happened to me that make me who I am today. And your character needs to have that too, except unfortunately for them, it's going to happen in, 60,000 to 80,000 words. And so you need to figure out what the most natural progression is of that arc and how you can squeeze it all together without it feeling forced. And I find that like adding more of these windows of opportunity for the character to change throughout helps really solidify the natural progression of their development as a character. And those are the big bad things of character development when it comes to plotting before you start writing your book. And they're good things to think about. There's so many different ways and different notes you can take on this and break it down into more and more detail. But just like as an overarching kind of conversation, I think those are the main things you should really think about when developing your characters, because these are the big things that will make your characters more realistic, and they'll just make them more meaty and a lot more fleshed out. And that's exactly what you want in the main character, or any character really. And if you're working on secondary characters, you don't need to do the whole big questionnaire that I was talking about. But you could think about their flaws, their backstory as well, what they look like, how they act, what their mini arc might be. These are all fun things to do. And it shouldn't feel like work. It should be like you're getting to know a new friend, really, which is what it is. So yeah, that's all I have for you today for characters. I hope you enjoyed that. We're going to keep going with the series, and I'll just try to think of all the different things that we can talk about. We might stretch further than this month because there might be more than what I thought there was going to be to talk about. So we'll see how that goes. But if you want to see more about this kind of like plotting and tips and tricks and just things to think about when you're starting to plot your novel, then make sure that you're subscribed and you hit the bell notification so you know when the next video comes out, which will be next week. So yeah, as always, I hope you enjoyed this. Thank you so much for listening to me chat. It's always awkward to talk to a camera and not a person, but I hope that you're enjoying these videos because I really enjoy making them. And as always, stay magical, and I will talk to you guys next week. Bye!